Good evening, everyone, and welcome to October's episode of Dóchas webinars. My name is Simon. I'm on the Mental Health and Wellbeing Working Group here at the Irish Support Agency. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands in which you are all watching. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So Dóchas will be brought to you on the first Monday of each month, with each session exploring a different aspect of health and well-being. So all of our previous webinars that we've held can be found on the ISA YouTube channel. So tonight on World Mental Health Day, we'll be exploring eating disorders. So what eating disorders are, some of the myths associated with them, and we will look at the supports and resources that are out there to support you or your loved ones. We're lucky tonight to be joined by Kate Mulray from the Butterfly Foundation. The Butterfly Foundation is the national charity for all Australians impacted by eating disorders and body image issues, and for the families, friends, and communities who support them. We're also very lucky to be joined by Jane Murphy, who has generously chosen to share her lived experience story with us. So thank you very much, Kate and Jane, for joining us. Before we go any further, I also wanted to mention that this evening there will be discussing eating disorders and there will be mentions of suicide and mortality. If any of the content makes you feel uncomfortable or upset, then Butterfly has a national helpline that you can contact from 8 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week, on 1-800-ED-HOPE or 1-800-334673. So we'll share the details of Butterfly in the chat after as well. So thank you. If you have any questions throughout as well, you can pop them into the chat and we'll either ask as we go along or we'll make some time at the end as well to open it up for some questions. So feel free to pop any questions that you have in there as well. So yeah, without further ado, good evening, guys, and thank you so much for joining us, Kate and Jane. So Kate, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the work you do with the Butterfly Foundation, please?
Yeah, sure. So thank you so much for having us both this evening. And it's wonderful to be having this conversation on World Mental Health Day as well. I can definitely speak on behalf of Jane and just say that we're very honoured to be invited here to have this conversation. It's one that's very close to both of our hearts and it's such an important conversation to have. So yes, I'm Kate. I am a counsellor, but I also run Butterfly's Lived Experience Speakers Program. So that's a program for people who have lived with an eating disorder or are living with an eating disorder who are wanting to share their story to encourage help seeking, raise awareness and reduce stigma. So that's why we have the lovely Jane here, because it's so important that we are listening to those voices of lived experiences and learning from them as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And can you give us a general understanding of what an eating disorder is?
Yeah, sure. So eating disorders are serious, complex and potentially life-threatening mental illnesses. In fact, they do have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness in Australia. The development of an eating disorder is different for a lot of people. There's no very clear-cut reason as to why someone would develop an eating disorder. It's an individual pathway where genetic and personality vulnerabilities kind of interact with social and environmental triggers. And a lot of the time, eating disorders will come with comorbidities such as depression, anxiety disorders, substance abuse, and personality disorders. In Australia at the moment, there are over 1 million Australians living with an eating disorder. However, what we also know is that less than 1 in 4 people with eating disorders are actually seeking professional help, and they're due to barriers such as stigma, shame, also the cost and availability of treatment. Yeah. So we would anticipate that number would actually be a lot higher. But they're the only kind of statistics we have based on those who are receiving help. In terms of the different types of eating disorders, some of the more commonly known ones are bulimia nervosa, anorexia nervosa, binge eating disorder, orthorexia, although that's not technically in the DSM-5 yet, and then other specified feeding or eating disorder. And this one's an important one to note, and this one actually makes up the majority of eating disorders. So this is where sometimes a person's symptoms don't exactly fit in with the expected symptoms for some that I've already mentioned. So they meet some of the criteria, but not all of the criteria. So example of this is atypical anorexia. So that's when someone has all the symptoms the doctor looks for to diagnose anorexia, except they're not classified as underweight or reaching that kind of BMI criteria. However, they still are experiencing, the psychological and physical impacts of anorexia nervosa, and sometimes people living with atypical anorexia, it can get missed because, health professionals are looking at a very clear criteria.
Yeah, no, brilliant, thank you. And could you just tell us a little bit about the work? I know I previously asked, but just about the work and the treatment that the Butterfly Foundation does.
Well, okay, yeah. So Butterfly, as you said, is a national charity for all Australians impacted by eating disorders. There are lots of different facets of the business. It originally started by a woman 20 years ago because her daughter was living through an eating disorder and she just couldn't find the support for her daughter. So started it at her kitchen table. Butterfly have our helpline, which you mentioned at the beginning, which is 8 a.m. till midnight, 7 days a week. We also have our education and prevention services team. We know that eating disorders impact people of all ages, but we are seeing a very high prevalence in our young people. So it's really important to be going out to schools and implementing those education programs because we know that body dissatisfaction is one of the highest risk factors for the development of an eating disorder. So trying to get in young, so that's a really big part. We also have kind of our communications team, which is really where that awareness pieces happen with some really great campaigns we do every year. And then we have our recovery and support services, notably Wundanerida, which is Australia's very first residential eating disorder facility on the Sunshine Coast. And that is a new method, or the first that's ever really been used in Australia, which is about the holistic care for someone experiencing an eating disorder, and then also support groups and for carers and for those living with an eating disorder as well.
Great, thank you for expanding on that. And with eating disorders, what are the most common misconceptions that you are aware of when it comes to eating disorders?
Yeah, so when we talk about eating disorders, we talk about them being about 10 years behind the conversation where depression and anxiety are at the moment. And misconceptions, stigma, and some stereotypes surrounding eating disorders are probably one of the biggest contributing factors why people are not coming forward to get help. So it's important to understand what those misconceptions are. The first kind of key misconception is that they only impact young white women. Eating disorders do not discriminate and can impact anyone, regardless of age, gender, size, socioeconomic status, cultural background. A third of people in Australia living with an eating disorder are male, although again that would be a lot higher, but men are not coming forward to seek that diagnosis because even sometimes they think it's a female illness. We also see high rates in the LGBTQIA+ community and also in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Another kind of big misconception is that anorexia is the main eating disorder. I think the media have probably played quite a role in that, sensationalizing it and showing quite emaciated images when discussing eating disorders. But anorexia only accounts for 3% of eating disorders in Australia, whereas binge eating disorder is 47%. So I think that's a little bit of a myth. The next big one is that eating disorders have a look. You cannot tell that someone is experiencing an eating disorder by looking at them. They are psychological conditions. Yes, they do have physical repercussions, but they are at the core psychological conditions. So, anyone can be experiencing one, and you do not need to present as being in an underweight body to be taken seriously or to be deserving of help.
Yep.
Another one that's probably not necessarily to do with eating disorders, but an important one to call out. I think in our society, we live in what we call a diet culture society. We normalize dieting, and it's a myth that it's normal to diet. Our society kind of tells us that thin equals healthy or thin equals attractive, and then we therefore feel a need to kind of change the way we look by going on a diet with the goal of changing our weight, shape or size. But diet's not designed to work. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And we also know that dieting is one of the biggest risk factors for the development of an eating disorder as well. So while we encourage focusing on your well-being and your mental health, which can include moving your body and finding a balanced and intuitive relationship with food, engaging in those kind of dieting behaviours, it's a myth that they're normal or should be kind of acceptable. Another one, eating disorders are for life. Recovery is possible. Recovery is not linear. It looks differently for different people, but they are treatable at any age or stage of a person's life. And I think the last big myth to call out, and it's one that Butterfly it's coming up a lot, probably because, the age we're living in, but the myth that social media causes eating disorders as well. And this kind of feeds in with it being a lifestyle choice or, a vanity thing. Eating disorders have been around for centuries. In fact, it goes back to hieroglyphics on ancient Egyptian, walls. And while social media can be one of those environmental or sociocultural environmental factors, it doesn't cause someone to having an eating disorder, but it can play a role in someone's body dissatisfaction, which can then, potentially lead to an eating disorder.
Brilliant. No, that was great. Thank you very much. And with obviously the last couple of years being in the pandemic, have you found that it had a really big impact on those that were living with an eating disorder? And I suppose what way were you able to communicate to people from the Butterfly Foundation as well? Yeah,
I think we've all got fatigue when it comes to the pandemic, and we're all kind of wanting to move into the next phase. But the effect that the pandemic had on our mental health is lingering, and it's enduring for some, and especially for eating disorders, it is important to acknowledge how difficult it was for those already living with an eating disorder, but also, sending some people into those behaviours. And again, just being aware that maybe some of those habits you adopted throughout the pandemic, they're not a result of it in terms of it being normal or acceptable, that maybe you have developed an issue, and it is really important to look into that and to seek help if you need it. The pandemic, from the beginning of the pandemic to now, we've seen a increase of about 69% in prevalence of eating disorder, which is huge. And there are a lot of different factors that have contributed to that, an increase in video calls, rapid changes to routine, eating habits and exercise behaviours, an increase of social media and news, isolation. We know that eating disorders thrive in isolation, and we've all experienced a lot of isolation. Again, lack of routine, that social anxiety returning back to normal life, but also all that harmful body and food talk, like the COVID kilos, and people being worried about other people commenting on their weight after lockdowns, and then I don't know if you noticed it, but all the diets that came out after COVID and smashed those COVID kilos, and gyms doing, specific programs to lose those COVID kilos. And that's, an incredibly triggering space. And again, that kind of diet culture profiting off our insecurities. So yeah, it was a very difficult time for the people across the board.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you very much. Jane, so thank you very much for joining us and sharing your story tonight. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience, please?
Yeah, first I'm going to apologize. I have a puppy here. So if she decides she wants to join in on the conversation, I'm really sorry about that. Yeah, so I am now someone who considers myself recovered, but I had an active eating disorder for well over 10 years. I started developing disordered eating habits when I was in primary school. I can actually pin it down to when I was 9 years old, because I had a little diary and I wrote about starting to restrict eating in my little diary. And over the next few years, I built up these habits of restricting how much food I would eat. And until when I was in high school, I had an absolute full-blown eating disorder. I can really trace that to a couple of factors. A big one is that I faced a lot of adverse childhood experiences and some exposure to domestic violence, and got a lot of criticism and comments and even abuse on how my body looked. And I really internalized that. And that's something that can happen at any stage in someone's life, but it's something that I think you're particularly vulnerable to as a child. And so I developed this idea that my body wasn't good, and especially that I was either fat or going to be fat. And I took charge of that in the way that I thought I could, which was to start restricting eating. When I got into high school, there was like a level of education included in the Victorian curriculum in terms of eating disorders. And I remember very clearly being told that there were two kinds of eating disorders. There was bulimia and there was anorexia. And the problem with having an eating disorder is that you get skinny enough that you die.
Yeah,
and I was a kind of awkward, chunky teenage girl, and I was like, well, I'm not going to die. I'm not too skinny. I'm like definitely in a puppy fat stage. And so I took that information and was like, all right, I can run with this. I can keep keeping up these really, on reflection, really dangerous behaviors of severe restriction and that kind of thing. And I didn't tell anyone that I was confident I had an eating disorder until I was 19. So a full 10 years after I initially started exhibiting disordered eating behaviors. And I didn't actually properly seek support for it after I'd figured it out until I was, I think, almost 22. So I spent well over half my life at that point with an eating disorder with no treatment or support. And one of the scary things is becoming a part of this beautiful community and learning that actually that story of having an eating disorder for years and years and not having any support, not seeking help is actually terribly common. You like to look at that kind of thing and go, no, it's just me who wasted years of my life, which is how I feel about it, being really sick. But no, it's super common for people to have that kind of experience. I've been on the recovery journey for 6 years now. And for me, that hasn't been linear. And it's been really hard as well. I ended up with first a diagnosis of bulimia, and that was not me. I've never had the behaviors that are required to have a diagnosis of bulimia. I very much restricted and didn't have that binging or purging aspect in my eating disorder. But the first person I talked to about it looked at me and went, "You're not thin enough to have anorexia." in the end, I've landed in an official diagnosis would be other specified feeding and eating disorder, but atypical anorexia. So a restriction-based eating disorder where I either maintained weight a lot of the time or even gained weight through periods of my eating disorder. And it is a journey to feel valid, but you look at the core symptoms, the restriction, the brain stuff, all that kind of thing, and that was me. So that is my my journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for sharing that, Jane. I know you touched on the I suppose education and support piece in high school. Could you elaborate a bit more on what the resources, I suppose, were like back then, and have you seen any improvement? And you know, did you feel like, I suppose, they were adequate at the time, or if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah. So as I said, I first heard about eating disorder through the compulsory high school education health classes here in Australia, and that was not adequate or appropriate. And I think that I'm confident that it did more harm than good for at least me. And then it took years of kind of having that little bit of knowledge of like, my brain is doing things that are in line with this mental illness. But what does it actually mean if I don't look like what I have been told I meant to, or what I think I meant to? And so I really sat with my illness for those several years until I started first talking to just a friend that I felt I could really trust. And then finally, when I was 21 or 22, I went to my GP, and I was actually getting treated for anxiety and depression. And I was coming to realize that I wanted my depression to get better, because that was really hard. And I was realizing that my eating behaviors were definitely making my depression worse. That's my dog.
Yeah.
And I thought I was super clever. I went into my GP and I was like, I'm just asking for a friend, but is there treatment available under Medicare for an eating disorder? And she was like, we can get you treated for your eating disorder, Jane. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. So she saw right through me, and that was fantastic. But then the next part of that journey is actually accessing that treatment. And that was really hard. I was living in regional Victoria, a person in a larger body with an eating disorder, and the treatment options that were available to me at that point were really, really inadequate. As I said, I sort of bounced through a couple of diagnoses before someone could actually say to me, like, no, based on your behaviors, you have and the symptoms in your brain. Again, noting that it is a psychological illness, that I had anorexia. But then even with that knowledge, I wasn't able to receive the kind of inpatient treatment that I probably needed, given how sick I was at the point that I got diagnosed. And when we looked into applying for those different programs, for me at that point in time, based on my location and other stuff like my weight at that time, I wasn't either eligible for actually accessing treatment that was near me, and some of the treatment facilities that were there actually either wouldn't accept me based on my weight being too high, even though I was incredibly sick, or that I was discouraged from applying because the staff there and the way that they approach their process would probably be re-traumatizing, because they wouldn't know how to handle someone who had an eating disorder but wasn't severely underweight. And I would like add an asterisk onto that, is that as a member of the community, I now know that it's not just that you have to have a BMI, which you may or may not know, BMIs are already kind of a dodgy concept, that's low enough to receive treatment, but actually you can be barred from accessing treatment for an eating disorder in terms of inpatient treatment if your BMI is too low, which is something that I have friends in the community who needed that kind of support and actually weren't able to access it. So yeah, I would say that the treatment that was available to me was pretty disappointing.
Yeah.
The actual journey that I went on involved a kind of cobbled together mixture of a psychologist and seeing a dietitian to like get back on track in terms of actually eating enough and that kind of thing. I've had to have a lot of support in terms of getting my nutrition back to a basic level in terms of having vitamin infusions and that kind of thing, because after 10 years of ongoing and severe restriction, your body doesn't do so well. And while the support was there and I did get it covered by Medicare for the most part, there wasn't as big of an out-of-pocket expense for me as there could have been. And like I absolutely wouldn't have been able to get treatment if it had have been all out of pocket. It was cobbled together, and I do feel almost a little angry about that. It should be better. I think that given how severe, how dangerous, and how terribly sad it is to live with an eating disorder, it's so isolating. We need there to be better stuff out there. And I will say that Butterfly is doing amazing work in terms of standing up Wanda narrator, and also that education that's really important, not just for the community, but also we need our healthcare professionals and support workers and all of that kind of thing to really be able to address eating disorders both adequately but also correctly, because I don't want any other person to ever front up to a doctor and go, I'm doing X behavior, and the doctor to look back at them and go, you don't look like you do that. Because for me, I had a really good relationship with my doctor, and it was, that process was easy for me for a bunch of unrelated reasons. But the idea of someone getting to the point of seeking help when it's so difficult, such a painful and difficult journey, and then having doors slam in your face, just terrible.
Yeah. And with the, I suppose, the recoveries at the moment, do you feel supported in that?
Yeah, recovery for me was not linear. It definitely had, the advances and the falls back, and for me, ongoing recovery has meant staying really connected to my medical team. I'm still actively managing my blood nutrition levels, and also the psychological support. I see a counselor. I probably will for the rest of my life, and I have no shame about that. And then the other part of it is the I guess building a community around me that is supportive of my ongoing journey. And it's funny that eating disorders being caused by social media is a big thing that comes up, because for me, social media was like hugely important. It was both like how I first became really aware of Butterfly, which was really, really important. But also just seeing other people who had recovered from eating disorders, other people who were living in larger bodies, who looked like me and had great lives, because that was a thing that I didn't feel was open to me, of like thin people are happy, So if you're not thin, you'll always be sad and have a terrible life. And that's been hugely important to my journey and staying on track. I will also say that like it's hard work. The process of recovering from an eating disorder requires a lot of determination, a lot of support, and that's both the practical stuff in terms of having a GP, having, for me, a nutritionist, but also having my beautiful partner, and family and friends and all of that kind of thing. And it is a choice every single day to be recovered, to stay on recovery, because going back to that thing about diet culture and that kind of thing, there are a lot of things that want to push you back off track.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane. And what would you say to anybody out there at the moment that's currently living with an eating disorder?
The thing that I wish that I could have said to myself, if I could go back and speak to a younger version of me, it would be that if you are engaging in these behaviors or even just these patterns of thought, you are sick enough. There is no point at which you will look in the mirror and be like, okay, no, I'm sick enough to get help now. It's not how your brain on this illness works, because you can't see how sick you are, but also just how dangerous these kinds of behaviors are for you. If you think you have an eating disorder, if you think you're moving towards developing an eating disorder, get help. And there's not going to be a point, if you wait long enough, that you'll feel like you're valid. I still feel, even now, like officially working with Butterfly, I still feel sometimes like a bit of a fraud. I was never hospitalized, for example, and that's a thing that people like really associate with severe eating disorders. No, I was so sick. I was so sick. And if you think this is you, or if you think this is someone that you love is dealing with, today is the time.
No, thank you. And what support from a friend or a family could we do better?
I think I'm going to throw that one to Kate.
So was the question as a
community, what could we do better to support our friends or family?
I think this question is quite layered, so I'll kind of start a little broader and then get a little bit more pointy. I think as a community more widely, I think one thing we can all do is be a hell of a lot kinder to ourselves and to others, and kinder to our own bodies and to other bodies. So that means trying not to comment on people's weight. It's very natural for people to kind of go, wow, you look great, you've lost weight. If someone is in the midst of an eating disorder and hears that, that can kind of just push them even further, because if you're talking to an eating disorder mind, they're like, great, it's working, keep going, you're doing a good job. So taking the emphasis and the value of what we look like, and reminding ourselves that we are so much more than what we look like. It's our values, it's our morals, it's our passions, it's our hobbies, it's the way we show kindness to other people. So just really holding ourselves accountable to take that emphasis off what we look like, prioritizing our mental health. You know what Jane said, that she'll see a counsellor probably for the rest of her life, and there's no shame in that. And I think that, you know, when I say to people, do you go to the gym? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so you're looking after your physical health, but we need to kind of look after our mental health too, and find ways to manage our feelings, and also practice self-compassion. That's another huge one. We're so critical of ourselves. And sometimes if you catch yourself, talking down or looking in the mirror and not really liking what you're seeing back, and you kind of go, you look like this, or I feel like this, you kind of think, would I ever say that to my best friend or someone I love? And the answer is always no. So why are we kind of talking to ourselves like that? So yeah, broadly kinder to ourselves and to others. In terms of what we can do as a community, we can be more educated on eating disorders. They are rife. Like everyone here and anyone you speak to will know someone who is living with an eating disorder. And we need to become more comfortable talking about them and more educated around them as well. And that's knowing the signs. Butterfly offers an amazing amount of resources on our website, but knowing the signs, kind of knowing if someone you care about is changing behaviours, they might start talking a lot about their body shape, weight, food and exercise. You might see changes in their mood. They don't seem like themselves. There might be noticeable physical changes. I will say, as Jane said, asterisks, if you notice physical changes in someone you care about, don't ever make that the topic of conversation. Don't kind of say, I've noticed that you've lost weight or you've gained weight. It's, I'm feeling concerned about you. Is everything okay? Because again, if they have gained weight because they might be experiencing a particular eating disorder, that's going to reinforce shame they might already be feeling. And if they've lost weight, then you might be, again, encouraging that eating disorder without even meaning to. They might be focusing on food and exercise more than they ever have. They might be, following a lot of accounts showcasing, body ideals. As Jane said, social media can be this incredible place where it's the first time that people have felt inclusion, and we've been able to see this incredible growth of diversity. So it can be a great place, but if you're noticing, someone kind of really focusing on certain people or fitspo or wellness influencers, just kind of keep an eye on that. And then also, not attending events, not kind of eating in front of you, really feeling them kind of pull away. So knowing those signs. And then the next step to that is, if you notice the signs, please, please, please don't wait and see. We know that the earlier that you intervene with someone experiencing disordered eating or eating disorders, and the sooner they kind of get that support, it lessens the severity and the longevity of an eating disorder. Too many people kind of say, oh, they don't see themselves, but I don't really want to have the conversation, or it's a bit awkward. And that applies to any kind of mental illness or mental health problem. That's not just eating disorders, but we really encourage you to have that conversation. If you are going to have that conversation, this is where we start to get down to the pointier end. You've got to understand as much as you can about eating disorders, which I've mentioned. It's really important to decide the best person to have that conversation, and always make sure that it's a trusted individual to that person. Decide where and when it should occur. Emphasis on the where. If someone is exhibiting behaviours of disordered eating or an eating disorder, best not to take them to a food-orientated location like a cafe or a restaurant. Take them somewhere quiet, not a public place. Think about what you're going to say. So as I mentioned before, not making it about physical changes, more about the person. A really big tip that we encourage is using language, using I instead of you. So I have noticed that you haven't been yourself, or I'm feeling concerned. As soon as we shift the language to you don't seem yourself, or it can come across as a little bit accusatory. And this might be things you've explored in similar webinars, because again, this is kind of across the board stuff. If someone is already in the midst of their eating disorder, it's important to prepare yourself that you will not get a good response. Everyone who has an eating disorder will explain it differently, but sometimes the eating disorder can really start to take over you and your mind and the person you are and the identity that you are. And if that process has already started to happen, and someone comes and sits down and you know, is trying to support you, your eating disorder mind is going to be like, you don't need help, you don't deserve help, don't listen to them, and you can be quite defensive. So if you are about to have a conversation with someone who might be in that space, just remind yourself that the person you love is in there, and that you just have to tell them that you're there for them and that you support them, and that, you know, if they're rude, you know, that's okay, maybe try again, but also understand that you don't have the sole responsibility to fix that person, to diagnose that person, that you just need to show them your love and support. And then if that conversation goes well, have resources. There are amazing resources, the Butterfly, obviously, NEDC, Eating Disorders Victoria, Eating Disorders Queensland, there's ANZ, there's a lot of different resources out there that you can rely on and present to that person. Even the helpline is just such a great place to start, because they're going to have a qualified counsellor who can listen to their concerns and try and guide them in the right direction.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Kate. That was excellent. I'm just conscious of time as well. So thank you both for your talk tonight, and I'll open it up for questions from the audience as well, so we can fit those in. So if anybody has any questions, we have a few in there.
There was just a question there in the chat box from Anya. Can I ask what a caregiver in your life, so I think, Jane, this was in reference to Lori, thank you so much. Can I ask what a caregiver in your life could have done to step in when you were in denial?
Yeah, I think I would mirror a lot of what Kate said to that one, in terms of that specific process. I think that the things that would have really spoken to me, just if you wanted to time travel and talk to me specifically, it would have been really emphasizing how, regardless of what I was feeling about myself, and the patterns of behavior, I guess, that I'd gone into, that I didn't deserve to be as sick and both physically and mentally as I was. The thing that I came to of my little manifesto was, even if I am disgusting, even if I am really that ugly and fat and don't deserve to be, and feel like I don't deserve to be happy, no one deserves to be this sick. And that is how I would approach that conversation if I had to have it with someone, because eating disorders are so incredibly destructive, so isolating. And I got to that point that Kate sort of described, where it felt like it felt like the eating disorder was like my life partner. It was such a prominent feature in my life. It was really a really scary and really sick time looking back. The other thing I would say that I would really, again, mirror what Kate said, is if I had to have that conversation with someone, or if I was coaching someone on how to have that conversation, I would very much be approaching it as saying, I've noticed this, and not coming to it and being like, do you think you might have an eating disorder? Because if you had have asked me that, I would have said no. No, I care about my health. No, I'm trying to improve my life. I'm trying to improve my self-esteem. I'm trying to look better, that kind of thing. Right up until I was really quite a way into recovery, I was in that very severe denial about what I was doing and why. But there were some things that were objectively happening. Like I wouldn't eat in front of people. I would eat a very, very limited array of things and that kind of thing. And those are things that you'll be able to point to if you're close to someone and go, a one that came up for me when I did have someone talk to me and they didn't quite approach it the right way, and it went down badly, was the person being like, I've never seen you eat lunch. And that's the kind of thing that you can notice about someone. So that's what I would encourage. And yeah, reach out for support for yourself as well, because it's going to be a really hard journey. It's unbelievably hard on the family and carers and that kind of thing.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Great. I think that is all the questions. Let me just have a quick look. Just a couple of thank yous coming through. So thank you both. Sorry, thank you, Jane. So yeah, Jane, this question for you again. So wondering if any work with your what work with your counselor has helped the most?
To be really specific, I've done cognitive behavioral therapy, looking at basically, as my understanding, when you learn something or have a thought, you create a little pathway in your brain, and the more you use a particular pathway, the stronger it gets and the more your brain wants to use it again. Kate might be able to describe this better. But I had a lot of those pathways that said really gross things about me, like that I was ugly and disgusting. And I went through a really long process of learning to use those pathways less, and working on building up new little pathways. So one's saying things like, no one deserves to be this unhappy, or my body does really good things for me. All my positive experiences happen through my body because my body is how I interface with the world, that kind of thing. And yeah, building those new little pathways and having your brain work differently and not spitting out these useless, horrible messages was a big part of empowering me to do all of the other stuff. Like once I accepted that all the great experiences I have in life are always mitigated through my body, that made it a lot easier to engage with going, one of the things that food does for us is it fuels us. So you have to eat because, like, I want to live a long life and go and see like all the awesome art in the world, that kind of thing. So that is the kind of therapy I did. I understand that CBT is pretty well supported for eating disorders, but at the same time, everyone's therapy journey is different. And if you go and speak to your first counselor or psychologist and have a terrible experience, you've got to go back. And that's one of the hard things, is that there are, through this journey, at least in my experiences, a lot of that door slam in the face thing. And having the resilience to go back, and if you don't like the first person, you don't like the first method, then trying again. And I'm on my 4th eating disorder counselor. The first couple just didn't work out, but now I'm in a great place and have a great counselor, and I'm doing really well.
Thank you. Great. I think that's all the questions from the audience. And Kate, I know you had mentioned throughout the conversation about the conversation on eating disorders being about 10 years behind the, I suppose, the mental health movement, and where that is at the moment, and how, I suppose, the stigma has been broken down and people are talking about it a lot more. So I think, obviously, with Jane sharing your experience and the great work that Butterfly Foundation is doing, that, you know, hopefully it's not 10 years. And so I want to thank you both. I know myself, I've learned a lot throughout this conversation. So, you know, and I know from all the positive comments going through from everybody, they have as well. So thank you both for the incredible work you're doing. And yeah, I want to thank everyone else for joining. We'll make sure to share the resources that we spoke about in the chat as well, and make the video live on the YouTube channel as well. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you everybody for joining, and thanks again, Jane and Kate.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks everybody. Cheers. Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right.
was just going to say bye to you, Una.
Yes, that was wonderful. That was so good.
Oh, thanks.
God, Jane can speak so well, can't she?
I know. She's amazing. She's absolutely
lovely.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah. I mean, there's like we've got 70 or so speakers in the program, and everyone offers a totally different experience. But I think Jane's story is just so important to tell, especially in breaking down those stigmas, because while every story is valid, you know, it's good to not always have, you know, the person who was hospitalized who nearly, you know, and have, when other specified eating disorders that make up the most of it, it's important we're hearing those stories.
Absolutely. And you could still almost hear the frustration in her voice, even
I know.
6 years ago or 8 years ago, that, you know, it was almost like a fight to get that recognition, and that on top of everything else that you're experiencing.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Oh, I know. We hear horror stories, people who go in thinking they've got an eating disorder who are in larger bodies, and then the doctor ends up trying to tell them they need to lose weight. it's yeah. And some people in larger bodies, they lose substantial amounts of weight, but because they started off in a higher body weight,
yes,
they don't reach that, but they're still experiencing exhaustion and fainting because they're so malnourished, and you know, so they're having all the same symptoms, but health professionals just aren't taking their condition seriously. So yeah, she's got an amazing story, and she's an amazing woman, and such a privilege to know her and be able to kind of work with her in these capacities. Yeah.
Well done to you too on the amazing work that you guys are doing.
Oh, thanks.
Because, you know, mental health has so much of a focus now, which is great, but eating disorders, you don't hear as much about it in terms of health space.
No.
It needs to be the case. So keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, got to advocate, keep and more care, better education, and you know, we by no means, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So yeah, but no, it's I love what I do, and you know, you inviting us and facilitating these kinds of conversations, it's because we just got through to people that we never otherwise probably had a touch point with. So we're so grateful for inviting us to have this conversation.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Kate.
No, you're welcome. You enjoy your Monday evening. Run up.
Yes. Cup of tea time.
And if anyone reaches out or you know, contacts you feeling like they've been a bit distressed from the conversation, or they've got some further questions, do not hesitate to reach out, and I'll
Brilliant.
in any way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah, good night.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.